Good evening, everyone. My name is Kim Dorman. I serve as the Community Engagement Coordinator for the Princeton Public Library. We're here tonight on Crowdcast, and if you have any questions at any point throughout the program, you can just put them in the Ask a Question feature. Before I introduce tonight's speakers, I'd like to thank our community partners for this program, the Princeton Adult School and Not in Our Town, Princeton, two organizations that are doing wonderful work in town. It's my great pleasure to be able to welcome two people tonight who are so well known and loved in this community and beyond to talk about the 2022 election, the voters, the issues, and the relevance of storytelling. Ingrid Reed, policy analyst, extraordinary human, and founder of a successful startup, New Jersey Spotlight, will introduce tonight's featured speaker. Please join me in welcoming them both.
Oh, thanks so much, Kim, and thanks to these people who are supporting this program. And it's so great to welcome Professor Saladin Ambar back here to the Princeton Library and to be talking about the election. I think you did that maybe 2 years ago, and here we have another election, and now we have the opportunity to talk with you about a very different election. Dean Ambar is also a senior scholar at the Eagleton Institute of Politics, a Center for the American Governor, and I'll talk a little bit more about that when I give him a longer introduction, but we're really delighted to have you back. Before, I guess some people will be looking at you here on the screen with us and saying, oh, you look familiar. Where have I seen you before? And I think there are lots of places where people could have seen you before because you've been on CNN and MSNBC and NJPBS and all of these places helping us understand what's going on in this election, and with good reason, because I looked at what you said your research interests are, and they are the American presidency and governorship, race and ethnic politics, American political thought, and political development. No better background than for what's going on now, and we're glad to have you. Somebody else who might be looking at this tonight and saying, wait a minute, do I know that person? And it might be one of your students at Princeton High School, or several, we don't know how many might be on, who would say, that was my teacher. And I think Princeton is very proud that, in effect, you got your start in this career of being a professor by teaching at Princeton High School in some ways. I'm sure there's a lot more to say about that. Dean, before we get started, I'd like to just remind people about the opportunities that we have to vote in New Jersey, because the opportunity to vote, I think, is an important issue in this election, and I hope you'll say more about that. But we all know that we can go and vote from early in the morning, 6 o'clock, until 8 p.m. on Election Day. But we now have an opportunity to vote during the week before. And that's really important to give people another opportunity. Starting on Sunday, the 29th, and running through November 6th, you can go and vote between 10 and 6 all around New Jersey. You'll have to look up where you should go. In most cases, that's at your municipal building, but go to njelections.org to make sure that you can find the place. The other thing is that we have no excuse vote by mail. You didn't get one in the mail because that only happened in the pandemic. You had to ask for one. But if you still would like to vote for by mail, you can get a vote by mail ballot by writing into the county election board before November 1st, or you can go and get one and vote by mail at the county office. And so I think that that kind of openness says something about what New Jersey stands for, and making a comparison to other places where we know things are not that open. So I hope people will take advantage of it. And now let's turn a little bit to what this election is all about. And Dean, I'll let you take that up. We had a question that came in and said, are there any races, congressional races, that are competitive in New Jersey that we should be watching? So that might be a good place to start. What's on the ballot, and what does that look like?
Well, first, let me just thank you, Ingrid, for inviting me to participate in this conversation. And to extend a thanks to the Public Library at Princeton for all the great work they do building civic engagement and community. So, and I am a proud, almost honorary Princetonian because of my years teaching at the high school that I look quite fondly upon. So many beautiful friends and memories from my time in Princeton. So thank you. You know, the race I'm looking at, and I think a lot of New Jerseyans are looking at, is the race between Malinowski and Kane Jr. Because in District 7, there's been some changes to the district with redistricting, and there's been some movement that seems to favor Republicans. And you have a race where Kane is not fully embracing Donald Trump, and nor is he embracing the big lie about the stolen election, in quotes. And yet he is also doing a bit of a dance with the former president and holding on to as best he can those voters who support Trump. And in Malinowski, we have an incumbent who is someone who I think New Jerseyans have embraced to a degree, and who has a kind of a presence on the ballot that I think is strong. And yet I think Kane is favored in that race, but not by much. And so I think it's a close race that will be telling about not just what happens in the House, but I think also how Republicans may or may not move forward with respect to Trumpism and a movement towards more autocratic politics rather than democratic politics. And given who Tom Kane Jr.'s father was and is in New Jersey history, I think it suggests that New Jersey may be one of the few states where moderation among Republicans may be in our future. But we will have to see the results and also what transpires in the aftermath of those races.
Does this race say something about what happens with redistricting? Because Malinowski's district was really made more Republican if you go by registration, but other races in New Jersey were actually where Democrats had been elected in the same class as Malinowski, did even better in getting more Democrats put into their districts. What does that say about redistricting, and is that going to be a factor that you see in other places as well?
I do, and I do see playing a role more broadly in the country, but certainly in New Jersey. I think Democrats have finally awoken from their slumber with respect to local races and local politics that I think Republicans have been focused on for the past 40 some odd years. Mm-hmm. And when we look at state elections and state secretaries of state and how presidential, but also legislative races are run and the significance of those races, it suggests that maybe the future of American politics with respect to small d democratic politics are going to play out at the local level, where things are more likely to get done than at the federal level, where regardless to the outcome that we see in this election, these midterm elections, there's likely to be some strong gridlock going forward. So I think to answer your question, I think what happens in New Jersey in these redistricting efforts only is suggestive of the fact that so much of what's taken place in American politics is now redounded to the local level. And that just means partisanship, frankly, which I think is unfortunate with respect to redistricting, is going to play an outsized role, not only in outcomes, but I think also in policy outcomes at the state level going forward.
It looks like politics at the local level is being injected in some places on a more partisan basis. We had a question that came in, another question about making reference to the fact that at the local level, there often isn't a competitive race, that one party or the other doesn't even bother to nominate people to run for office. And what's that all about? In school board races, this election period, seem to see many candidates running for election. And we're hearing that, particularly among Republicans, as you noted, across the country, there seems to be more interest in local races. But how do you answer a person who says, why should I go to the polls if one party doesn't even want to put up any candidates? What does that say for our representative democracy, if it does? Because I assume the choice was the idea when the founders worked through the Constitution.
Well, sure, but American party politics obviously were not anticipated by the founders, and certainly multi-party politics have been unheard of for the most part in our country. Mm-hmm. So having different issues represented through candidates is what matters. And so the Democratic candidates and Republican candidates are going to have to reflect a greater array of issues that are important to voters. I'll give you an example, and if I can make a California connection to New Jersey, I was out in Los Angeles not long ago, Malibu actually, if I can invoke that wonderful image on this frosty fall evening.
Right.
I was doing
that seems pretty good.
Well, there's a wonderful student out there, former student of mine named Louis Abramson, who's running a race for state assembly. And what is he running on? He's running on being a renter. He rents in a state, in a district where so many people own homes. And that is a huge issue, along with the environment and a host of other issues that Democrats, and he's a Democrat, care about. But he's found an issue that matters to about a third of the voters who probably would not have had that issue cared for at that level. And I think what we have to encourage, regardless to party, but certainly, moving forward at the state level, is are candidates who are going to raise different kinds of issues to get noticed, but also to have those issues that are a concern of voters who are a little bit voiceless on some of these issues. I don't know how many people are running who are talking about, rent reform, but Lewis is, and so I think that's an important point to make. The issues are going to have to bubble up from the candidates, and maybe voters can demand new kinds of issues be raised as well.
Well, I guess that comes up in the school board races, which seem to we're getting a lot of attention, and maybe you recall more about the governor's race in Virginia, where schools of teaching, they said sexuality, I would say human relationships, got to be an important issue in that election. And we're seeing a lot of school board elections being around that issue as well.
That's absolutely right. I mean, I'm actually writing an article right now for this Cambridge Companion on the Declaration of Independence, and I've been asked to write about critical race theory and dissenters from the Declaration of Independence. Well, it turns out that there really aren't that many people who are Black political thinkers historically who dissent from the Declaration. What they dissent from are sort of the hypocrisies or failures of the country to live out the creed of the Declaration. A lot of these wedge issues are just that. They're inventions, frankly, oftentimes from the right, that are meant to divide people and to conjure up, ghosts in this Halloween season to, scare people, frighten them to death that somehow the country they've grown up in will no longer belong to them. And I think the way to combat that is through in-person meetings, which I think initially, certainly the anti-federalists placed a premium on. And the thought was that somehow our federalist system of government would, create the kind of atmosphere at the local level where people felt represented. Unfortunately, I think there's so much alienation, even at the state level, that we have a much stronger road to hoe, or we have to be stronger in managing this sense of alienation going forward, because I think that's where people are. They don't feel heard And
Mhm.
if they're not heard at the local level, then we really are in trouble.
Yeah, it seems that reports that come in New Jersey, there are a substantial number of towns where it's been impossible to have a rational discussion or a rational contribution of ideas made in school board meetings. And people ask, how can we bridge that gap? How can we, in uncivil ways? It's not even sort of under the radar, and when you leave, you know who was what on what side and so on. But that the meetings themselves seem to negate any kind of common understanding that, at the local level. But how do we get around that? It's not even party politics, is it?
Well, there's a general loss of civility that we've seen over the last 4 or 5 decades in American politics, but not only in politics, culturally, a loss of civility. And I hate to be, the old man on the lawn crying out for civility, but let me say, yes, I want to be that man. I want to say that there has to be a way to answer Madison's question in the affirmative, that first Federalist paper where he asks whether or not it's possible for us to establish government by reason and choice rather than through accident and force. Can we do this through reasoning? Can we do this through discussion, deliberation? Or are we going to perennially return to violence? And, the kinds of language we use in talking, how we share with one another, how we listen with one another, all of that are the habits of the heart that Alexis de Tocqueville talked about, that we have to cultivate. You can't tell your partner, I love you once, and that's it. The language of democracy is romantic. You return to it over and over again. The decorum, the edifices that you build that relate to, deliberation and reason. All of those things are cultural in the end. They don't exist out in the atmosphere. They're really cultural habits. And I think, how do we do it? We start with who we are personally. Self-government, in the best sense that the founders meant that we show some restraint in how we manage our own lives. And I think that's a huge part of this. Not giving in to others who wish to escalate language and resort to hostility is a huge, huge problem. And I think the Black freedom struggle, frankly, in American life historically has taught us better than any other movement, I would say, or at least as well as anyone historically in this country, that democratic life is premised upon a commitment to nonviolence, a commitment to deliberation, to hearing one's opponents out politically, but not demonizing them. That's what we have to return to. And it can't, frankly, be taught only during Black History Month to African Americans. We all have to engage in a kind of peaceful, nonviolent discourse and embrace it. That's where we have to get as a country.
Right. It seems that how we vote or who is in charge of there's a difference between voting and elections now, the way elections are run, which seems to come into a kind of trust factor. Can we trust the people to whom we have given some responsibility? And as you think about this election coming up and the number of measures that have been taken to make it harder to vote or to not even sympathize with voters themselves, that you can drink water online. Even here in New Jersey, there are people who ask me, if I put my ballot in one of those deposit boxes, will it get to the place where it will be counted, or will somebody carry the box away or something? There just seems to be a level of trust that has evaporated to some extent, that is at the bottom of the challenge to voting, so that I think people are feeling uncertain about something that they really didn't feel uncertain about when maybe they should have if they thought back to Hudson County, 100 years ago. But we've sort of put that behind us and have come out with a relatively good system. Of course, voting rights in many parts of the country are still not, or have been made worse, but rather than better. But how do you address that kind of trust in activities that we have to engage in order to have a democracy?
Well, I think one thing we can do, and I think should do, is not belittle people's lack of trust or their sense of alienation. Look, as I often share with my students, the last 20 some odd years of American government, is a series of unmitigated failures. The, failure to protect the nation on 9/11, the failure to find weapons of mass destruction, the failure of Katrina, the failure of the Great Recession, the failures to manage the COVID-19 crisis, and on it goes. I mean, these are not like small, issues. These are massive failures of government. And I think we have to acknowledge that that alienated spirit is there. It goes back at least until, as far as Watergate in more recent memory and Vietnam. But these last 20 years have been an object lesson to people that somehow their government is not there for them, but only for the wealthy or the well-connected, et cetera. So we have to recognize that. But by the same token, we also have to recognize that the solution can't be turning towards, your favorite host on Fox News and, cuddling up with a fear blanket. That can't be the answer. The answer can't be to demonize immigrants. The answer can't be to demonize, members of the LGBTQ community or Jews or Muslims or people who don't look like you. The answer has to be in community. The answer has to be found in elevating the discourse. I think ultimately people aspire to that, but they have to see some reason to aspire to that. And how do we do that? Well, we have to exemplify the beloved community, however and wherever we can, as members of a community, as Dr. King called us to exemplify. We have to, share honestly with people and respectfully with people. And we can't yet run from the lies. I'm not personally speaking. I don't speak on the behalf of Eagleton when I say this. Personally, I'm not a big fan of Brian Kemp's politics in Georgia. My personal choice would be for Stacey Abrams to win that race. But I think we have to elevate Brian Kemp. We have to elevate people like Mitt Romney and Liz Cheney, who may not hold forth our kind of policy issues, but people who have nevertheless demonstrated some strong commitment to democracy, to the idea that the rule of law matters. We have to recognize those folks and applaud them for, being patriots in the best sense of the word, not in the shallow, cheap sense that it's often thrown around. These are people who care about the democratic system and self-government. And dare I say, it is under assault. And these midterm elections are, I think, revealing the kinds of candidates who, yes, want to win, but also not win at any cost. And I think, that's part of what we as citizens need in these elections. And we have to hold those individuals and candidates high in esteem when they do exemplify that spirit.
Well, what do you hear from your students and maybe other people? How can we we need to think about those things, but people who we want to vote really say that it's their own well-being. It's what the toll that inflation is taking on them. The people who are suffering because we didn't address climate change, or it seems there were a handful of people who made sure that we wouldn't address climate change. How do you describe what the next step should be in those kinds of situations? How do you say you shouldn't worry about inflation as much as you should worry about the candidates who don't want to follow the rule of law, who don't respect our values. And is there a chance that this election will show that we can think about our future as a democracy and say, yes, we'll deal with inflation because it's something that everybody is experiencing? I just really wonder how you answer that question.
Honestly,
if you do.
Yeah, no. Well, the way I will share with you how I answer it when it comes up to students, and I tell them that I read, I guess this was probably at the start of the pandemic, 2 volumes by Volker Ulrich, the German historian, who wrote a 2-volume biography of Adolf Hitler. Mm-hmm. And it's a chilling account of how and why Germany slipped into the kind of brutal regime, horrific regime that it did. And Ulrich does a magnificent job. I don't know who his translator was because it was written in German. I don't know if he speaks a lick of English, but it's a magnificent and terrifying book. But nevertheless, he shows how the Nazi Party went from really about 7 men, at a beer hall that expanded into, maybe several dozen thugs who ultimately formed a party that took over the country. And I say that not to create a kind of false equivalency of what's happening in America. What I do say is that economic issues and concerns are critical. We need to listen to people and not belittle the fears and real pains of citizens who are struggling economically. But what we have to hold in highest esteem above everything is the rule of law and self-government. And countries have fallen, democracies have fallen over economic fears and anxieties, and we cannot allow that to happen here. So yes, I remember as a young boy living through the long lines of the Carter years, watching people line up for gas, for unemployed relatives. But the solution to that problem can't be to create a thugocracy. The solution can't be to abandon democratic life. The solution can't be, I win regardless to what you say the outcome is. I can't find my approved Secretary of State to put me into office or discount tens of thousands of votes. That can never be the answer. I don't care how high inflation is. We cannot allow ourselves to descend into a country premised upon, brute force. Again, back to Madison in Federalist One. The answer to the question can't be the rule of law is extinguished so that bread prices go down. That can't be who we are. We have to be bigger than that. And I think we have to express and share with folks historically and in real time the vulnerability we have with respect to democracy. We have to, as Lincoln said in that Lyceum address back in 1838, we have to not commit suicide as a nation. That's the language of Lincoln. As someone who's just newly entered into politics, we cannot fall by suicide. We have to embrace the rule of law and at any turn, condemn vigilantism, mob rule, and the autocratic spirit that was then surfacing in America that he bore witness to and that we are seeing resurface now. No way can we allow real economic challenges to be a launching pad into something even more disastrous. We have to talk about it, and we have to share history and speak the truth about the past in our country, but also in other countries that have witnessed the kind of decimation of democratic life under the banner of better times are coming.
So I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. As you look around at the elections taking place in the various states, and think about your advice about speaking up and emphasizing what's important, calling on people's better instincts. Do you see any races that you think where candidates are doing a good job of that? I mean, it seems to be a very partisan thing that either it's the Democrats standing up and saying, we have to, in very convincing ways, say we need to stand up for what we believe in, for what this country really is. And you see Republicans certainly casting doubt on elections that could doom basically our right to vote and what our vote means. Are there any races that we should be watching where you see this playing out in ways that people would understand what you were saying?
Well, I think a positive, if you look at the Michigan race with Governor Whitman there, I think it's a very impressive moment for her, but also for democracy, that somehow people in Michigan are recognizing, it seems to me, her own leadership talents, but also what it would mean to embrace the other side. And I will come back to Georgia, which I think, Stacey Abrams is facing an uphill battle. And ironically, I think it's in part because Republicans may feel and independents may feel, at home and fair about voting for Kemp because he has, been more moderate compared to other candidates, not only in Georgia, but around the country. And you know what? As terrible as that might be for someone who personally may, again, not support Kemp's policies, I'd rather lose with someone who's supportive of democracy than win a race where, the spirit of fascism, if I can invoke that word, holds forth. Candidates have to draw a line. And again, at least Kemp drew a line. Now, maybe he shouldn't pat himself on the back too forcefully for doing his job, but these are the times we're in. These are the times we're in. Not, yes, we're going to have to, if not back people politically, then at least encourage a demonstration of the democratic spirit wherever we find it. So I'm hopeful about Michigan and at least grateful in respect of Georgia that race has at least the tenor and tone. And I watched that debate there. The tenor and tone is reasonable compared to what I've seen elsewhere. And I don't want to necessarily throw names around, but what I've seen elsewhere is stark and terrifying.
Is Ohio another example of that?
No, I think so. I think, some of, I don't want to overplay Midwestern nice, but I think, Ohio is an example of that. And I think we're going to have to encourage those kinds of debates that are, again, oriented towards the issues rather than, ad hominem attacks. And frankly, again, just the denial of electoral outcomes that are clear and evident. In this case, I'm thinking about, President Biden and 2020. Yeah, I think we see some small sieves of hope, in some of these elections, but not enough, not nearly enough to make me, be sanguine about the future. We have a lot of work ahead of us still.
Right. Many people look at a lot of these and say, if we had more local and state good journalism, we might be able to do a better job of getting candidates to be responsible and call them to question. I think of Tom Moran at the Star Ledger when people say we don't have people who stand up and speak. But apparently, if you look across the country, covering local races and for over a period of time, not just the one debate, and also a lot of states don't have really strong state newspapers anymore. I think the Philadelphia Inquirer, for example, is trying hard to be a newspaper that tries to focus on what needs to be done in the city. But is that another part of what you have to look at if you feel like democracy is fraying?
Oh, absolutely. As the kids would say, Ingrid, 100%. Yes, 100% correct. We have to look at newspapers. Look, as a Sun-Time columnist myself for NJ Spotlight Online,
Right.
I can't help but applaud, any venue that, promotes intelligent discourse about politics or culture, or what have you. We need strong journalists. Jeffersonian democracy, if nothing else, it's premised upon freedom of speech and strong newspapers. Lots of
right. Well, and it's not, as you've noticed, it's not necessarily opening the big pages and then putting them in the garbage. It's really, if we had strong journalism, that's the word, journalism, online, we would be doing better.
I think so. And here's where, the internet and social media has been a blessing, but also a curse. Maybe we're all guilty to this. I read 2 articles or 2 headlines and feel I'm an expert on, you name it, bungee jumping to, the Antarctic. I think I know it all because I read 2 headlines. That is a real problem. I will say it's interesting, to talk about online versus newspapers, and we're certainly not going back to an era where every house had a paper in front. But we also have to recognize that is a loss. I do believe there was something lost in the exchange from tangible, in your hand information that maybe laid around the house and was present in front of you. Maybe as a kid, I know I picked up the Daily News as a kid in New York, growing up in Queens. And, you read the sports, you read the horoscope as a kid, but then you read the headlines, and then maybe you read some articles, and all of a sudden you were a newspaper reader, and it was there every day, along with, at the time, my mom's pack of cigarettes and a Diet Coke or Pepsi. It was there every day. Why? Because I wanted to go to the store and buy it. There's something about the online presence that you can take for granted and skim, whereas I think you're more apt to be indulgent. Now, we have to find ways of being more indulgent and more engaged online, and also to prefer and seek out better sources online. And I'm afraid, from what we've all read and learned over these past years of experience with the internet and online sources, that there's a lot of bad information out there, and it's poorly monitored and tracked. And if nothing else, it falls prey to sort of the capitalist orientation of our economy, which is, bad information, gets more hits because it's more exciting and shocking, and I think that's a huge problem. We've got to deal with that.
Well, aren't you amazed though at the many podcasts and how people really sort of promote the podcast that they like to read, or the summary of the news, and it's a little bit the way newspapers had columnists, and everybody read certain people and believed them. I think the podcasts are similar to that, and of course you pick and choose who you want to believe. But it seems to me that there are really a lot of sources for all of the bad stuff. I don't even know where it is. There are people who are trying very much to bring forth real news that's backed up. What I don't see online that I remember seeing on the front pages of the newspapers are maps. I was very frightened and influenced by the front page of the Philadelphia Bulletin that would have the maps of how the war was going. I go back that long, and I see in the Times how often they will have a diagram on the front page that says more than a picture. And that you don't find online, I don't think, that kind of visual reinforcement of news. And so I think that's one of the things that it's hard for people to make up their own minds quickly by seeing something that speaks to them. And can we take one other look at who are the candidates who are running? Are you encouraged by what you're seeing in terms of age and ethnicity, race, and so on? Are the collection of candidates reflecting at least some part of a newer generation? Do you believe in time limits? Do you have to wait until you're 89 to get out of being a senator for 6 terms? A lot of people have said we need new blood, and I'm not sure the new blood that's stepping up is necessarily what we want, but just was wondering if watching this kind of thing over the decades and so on, do you see any difference in who's running?
Not particularly. I think, we are almost like Hollywood and maybe bad television. We go back to, these sequels. Why? Because they're known brands, and who am I to say? I mean, I wrote a book about Mario Cuomo. Andrew Cuomo, Tom Kane Jr., we tend to replicate dynastic, candidates. We tend to replicate certain styles of campaigning. What Sarah Palin introduced in, a few years back is now being replicated over and over again on the right. We tend to reproduce a certain kind of politics that comes out of almost the entertainment world. And I think that's worrisome. Look, I think Jefferson's argument was maybe not for term limits, but for, to refresh, if I could use that term, to refresh the button of democracy every 19 or 20 years by revisiting the Constitution, creating more, opportunity for changes generationally. But, we also have a system that's quite Madisonian, Hamiltonian. It's quite rigidly set against change. There's so many veto points in our system against change. And to be even more frank, we have a system now that is very much, in the mode of rewarding people who can tear down their opponent through vitriol, through suggestion, through rumor, and the personalization and demonization of issues and candidates and their backstories, etc., makes it awfully hard to make running for office attractive to young people, aside from the fact that there's so much money required just to get into the game. And here's where I put on my hat and I support Bernie Sanders, and I support the idea of, fully financed elections at every level. There's no reason why we have to, capitulate to a system that rewards people based on how much money they can raise. That is a huge, huge problem going forward. So it's one of the many challenges we have. Right now, I just like to have an election that doesn't lead to violence at the federal level, state level. I'll take what I can get.
I hate to laugh about that.
I try not to be greedy about it, but yeah, I would like to see not a descent into violence. And frankly, that's what where we seem to be heading.
Right,
and I think everyone needs to reread that Lincoln address, that Lyceum address, for what it portended to him, but also what it suggests to us, because that was about 22 years away from the Civil War. And I'm not suggesting we're going to have another Civil War. But what I am suggesting is that we're probably a generation away from even something in our own context that we can't quite put our finger on, that's equally troubling if we don't, adhere to the lessons of the past and move in a different direction.
Right. Dean, I want you to talk about your book, but I just thought I would ask Kim if there were any questions that came in while we were talking, so we could answer a few of those. Kim, are you listening to us?
Yes, I am. Thanks, Ingrid. I did also just, since Ingrid's about to talk about it, you can purchase the book Stars and Shadows, The Politics of Interracial Friendship from Jefferson to Obama with Labyrinth, using the buy the book function, if you'd like. Perfect. Thank you, Ingrid. Our first question is, in terms of the Senate race in Pennsylvania, considering that it's a swing state, what policies should the candidates discuss in order to win over the majority?
Well, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Why did we not mention Pennsylvania before? That's so interesting, right next door.
Well, I think we're seeing some of it, but not nearly enough. In other words, Fetterman and his personality and the personality and persona of Oz, those things are, right in front and center of voters. But there are some questions about economic issues that have, moved forward, but not nearly enough. And also not nearly enough about the threats to democracy that are represented through Oz's support for Trump. I think in terms of Democrats, but there you have a sort of a almost a object lesson in where the country is moving towards the kind of WrestleMania style elections where candidates based on name recognition and popularity in the case of Oz, or a kind of everyman persona, if you will, with Fetterman, really hold forth and kind of replace sort of the old style candidacies where people put issues forward rather than candidate-centered personas and elections. And that's where we've been and have grown. Blame in part John McCain for selecting Sarah Palin, but blame us, the electorate, for not demanding candidates who are stronger in terms of on the issues and sort of abiding this descent into popularity and again a sort of WrestleMania style elections. Pennsylvania, I think, exemplifies that. Not nearly enough. I mean, I don't know if folks in Princeton, I'm inundated with ads all the time coming out of Pennsylvania, and they're not really exactly on the issues. They're pretty dark and bleak. They're pretty bleak ads.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But it looks like the governor's race is probably more engaged.
It seems so,
or polarized. Polarized into actually where they stand, honestly. But is there another one, Kim? I'd like to get.
Yep. Nikolai Margolis says, I'd be really interested to hear what effects you would predict from our democracy's shift in the past decades or so.
Expect when? In this election, or?
I don't know.
What effects? Well, I think I will say the effects are really up to us. If we continue unabated, we're heading towards a more and more an increasingly divided country where demographic changes tied to immigration, sort of a loss of public spiritedness rooted in fear, has us more and more looking at one another through a jaundiced and frankly hateful eye. But it doesn't have to be that way. I do believe we have choices to make on an individual level, and that's where it starts, but also in local level and in communities to turn that spirit around. Take the American civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s that we all have come to know and love. This was a movement of ideas as much as it was a movement of people physically marching and protesting. It was very much ideas oriented. Civil rights leaders, but also ordinary people were carrying around books and pamphlets tied to nonviolence. And people were reading a host of important works about, not only nonviolence, but the nature of democracy. People were reading and getting those ideas out. We have to aspire and believe that our fellow citizens should not be talked down to. They should be engaged. One of the inspirations for my book was another book written by Danielle S. Allen called Talking to Strangers. And Allen talks about the need to do just that, to engage people who we maybe otherwise wouldn't, simply because not doing so is riskier to ourselves, but certainly to the Republic, than engaging. And we've got to find ways of doing that, even when it maybe is a little uncomfortable, because the alternative is devastating.
Why don't we turn to your book? Because I think that in reading it, I loved the idea that you were telling us stories about a trust that people established that was, I guess, the basis for friendship. They had to do what you've just been talking about. They had to go a little bit beyond themselves to find common ground that might then lead to that, your definition of friendship. Maybe we should explore a little bit, because it's not going out drinking, and having a good time. It's more than that, a kind of that trust relationship that you have with people. So what made you decide to write this book, first of all, when you have so many obligations as an academic and an influencer, I guess, because it seems so personal that you had to write it. So could you tell us about it?
Well, I think, you reach a stage in your life as someone my age who also has had some success as a professor, and you make a determination about what is not so much important for promotion anymore, not what is so important for, to win some prize in the academy. It's really what you want to leave your children by way of legacy. You care about your soul more than about, developing some kind of reputation professionally. This is my fifth book. It's not my first. Early on, you're concerned about tenure and promotion and making a name for yourself. And then at some point, there's sort of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You realize self-actualization is important. I'm someone with 15-year-old triplets. I care about their future. I care about them personally. I want them also to be proud of the work I've done in my own life. Friendship for me is personal, but it's also political. How can I engage people around me in a way that's going to improve their lives and not just selfishly my own? I think that kind of spiritedness comes through a recognition at a certain stage, hopefully in your life, where you realize there are more important things than just your own professional or professorial success. There are things that matter, that are ineffable. And I think I wrote this book, out of a spirit of longing to produce more of that in my own life. And it just so happened, I feel that the country needs it too. And there were some lessons, I thought, historically, that spoke to that need and longing that might be able to help push us in the better direction.
So you started out with Jefferson and a relationship that somebody sought with him, that he had to make some decisions. You want to just say a little something about that, and then maybe jump to the one that I was really surprised about and learned a lot more about the seeking of racial justice in our lifetimes, and that's Angela Davis and Gloria Steinem. There are others in between, but I think those two choices were sort of interesting, not even inspiring. Can you say a little bit about the Jefferson one, and then the two women?
Of course. Well, let's give Jefferson some credit. He, as Secretary of State, had been commissioned by Washington to help establish the nation's capital in what would become Washington, D.C. Jefferson hired a team of surveyors to go to the Potomac region and to lay out the boundary stones of what would become the nation's capital. Jefferson saw this as a monumental, no pun intended, endeavor. He wanted to memorialize the people involved in the process, because he understood that this would be the seat of a great empire, what he would later call an empire of liberty. And he wanted a black man to be part of it. He had heard the stories about a free black man in Maryland named Benjamin Banneker, who had built a clock by hand that was magnificent. He had produced this wonderful and scientifically and astronomically accurate almanac. And Jefferson heard about this some 60-year-old black guy in Maryland who was this marvelous scientist, and he said, I want him to be there. Jefferson understood the importance of it historically, symbolically for the country. And Banneker goes and he works on the surveying team. You can still see images and in person the actual boundary stone that Banneker is purported to have laid. There's an iron fence around it. It's a bizarre thing to see. But in any case, Banneker comes home and afterwards writes Jefferson a letter and says, hey, appreciate you putting me on the surveying team. Let's talk about the Declaration of Independence. Let's talk about all men are created equal. Let's talk about your support, at least implicitly, for slavery. How could you write those words and nevertheless not recognize the liberties of my brethren? It's a very long, elegant letter. I'm really not doing it justice. Read the book, read the letter online.
Right,
In any case, Jefferson responds in a very short letter and says, hey, got your letter? Guess what? I wish there was more evidence of men like you who would demonstrate the power and intellectual capabilities of the black race. No one wishes more than I do to see your race in a better position down the road, et cetera, et cetera. It's a kind of a bit of the back of the hand from Jefferson, but he sends the almanac that Banneker sends him off to the Academy of Sciences in Paris. He commends to the Academy there Condorcet, the credentials and esteem of Banneker and what he represents. And yet he doesn't really raise a finger about slavery. He doesn't do anything to change his countrymen's policies on the issue. He goes silent. And he also, in other letters, belittles Banneker. And so there's this weird, surprise, surprise, with Jefferson, back and forth tumult on the issue of race and slavery that Banneker nevertheless calls him on quite courageously in his letter to Jefferson. And Banneker uses Jefferson's letter back to him, Jefferson's response, as an opportunity to promote racial equality by saying, look, the Secretary of State has responded to me. The Declaration of Independence author has responded to me. Look at how far we have come and how much further we have to go, but look at what's possible. It was a failed friendship ultimately, even though Jefferson responds to Banneker as one of his brethren. Incidentally, that gets him into trouble politically, and I talk about that in the book. It's really a fit and start, a kind of stillborn relationship, frankly, that is really problematic, but there's some effort there that suggests what might be possible down the road, and we see some of that with Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln and others. On to Angela Davis and Gloria Steinem. They have a very rocky beginning. I guess in 1962 at a Helsinki conference in which Davis is there as an avowed socialist, someone who's supportive of global communism, and Gloria Steinem is there tamping that down. They're under the aegis and support financially of the CIA. And so it's a kind of at odds initial meeting. Mm-hmm. Later for Steinem, as she becomes the iconic feminist that she would become, also does something unique for white feminists at the time, and that is she really cultivates the idea of intersectionality. Right. And reaches out when Angela Davis is in her most dire moment and becomes treasurer of the Free Angela Davis organization or movement, financing her movement, which cost her tremendous political capital in American life. Nevertheless, she supported Davis, said that Black women taught me feminism, really profound. And that, frankly, hadn't been the language of most white feminists at the time. Betty Friedan and others were slow to come to that intersectional moment. But Gloria Steinem was there from the beginning. And I think we have to recognize that. And ultimately, their friendship would evolve in a more distant way than perhaps others. You know, James Baldwin and Marlon Brando, Shirley Jackson and Ralph Ellison, much closer friendships. But ultimately, after Donald Trump's election, they co-chaired the Women's March. Maybe some of the listeners here or people who were watching this attended that march in 2017 after Donald Trump's election. Why were they chosen? Because of their personal connection and friendship, but also what they represented to the country in terms of democratic possibilities and what women can and should be doing at the front, the tip of the spear, if you will, for shaping democratic life going forward. It's a very interesting chapter and at times hard chapter to write because there had been these fits and starts, but also these beautiful bouquets of moments where you saw a flowering of democratic possibilities in the relationships between these two iconic women. Ultimately, I hope readers enjoy the chapter as well and come away with a lot for themselves personally.
Thank you, Dean, for writing the book, for giving us a chance to examine some deeper thoughts and some deeper relationships than many of the very lacking in depth discussions that we're seeing in our political scene. There's hope. Maybe 10 years or 20 years from now, your kids will be able to find some other friendships to add to that book. But thank you for that and for today's discussion, and to the public library and the adult school and Not in Our Town for making it possible for us to explore with you some very scary moments, actually, but also some hopeful ones. So thanks so much. And we look forward to another year, and we hope another election that will be part of our democracy. So good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone. Thank you so much.